The worst part about mansplaining is that it happens when people don't even realize it and your friends do it to you. So oftentimes when I'm doing homework with all my guy friends and we're working on physics or we're working on math, you hear about that really cliche story about how women will have an idea and people will discredit it, and then 5 minutes later a man will say the exact same thing, and everyone will accept it as the correct answer, and you'll go forward with that idea even though the woman in the room had that idea like 5 or 10 minutes ago and she voiced that. And so that is it's a very real thing that happens to me all the time with my friends, and it's really hard because you don't know how to say to them, hey, just had that idea like 15 minutes ago. Why didn't you accept that? Or why didn't you go forward with it when I had it? And so it really kind of destroys your self-confidence, which really sucks. And I think just kind of being brave and telling your friends, because they aren't even conscious when they do it, which is just like a really huge statement about society, like, oh, men thinking that they're right, women not right. But one thing that's been really helpful is that my friend Rachel is also in physics and math, and we really stick together, and when she or I have an idea, we vocalize like, hey, let's try that. Like, let's stick together as women and prove that we are strong, we are smart, and don't let people mansplain too much, or when they do, call them out on it, and that's the only way that they'll learn that it's not okay, and that you can learn that you have a voice and you can womansplain back at them how to do the problem.
So my very old, traditionalist, drunk, overweight Uncle Tom came to visit my mom and I a couple years back, and he wanted to take us out to dinner. And so my mother and I were like, yeah, we're fans of eating. We like the food. So we agreed, and we get to the restaurant, and my mom and I look over the menus, and I really had my eyes set on a nice pasta. And the waiter comes over, and before we can open our mouths, my uncle just says, yeah, they'll both have, I think, the salads. Yeah, that sounds good. All the steak. Okay, great. And the waiter just took it and left. And me and my mom just looked at each other. We couldn't believe that had happened. And he's like, yeah, Shelby, you're vegetarian, right? I mean, you look it. And that really sucked. I really wanted some meat. So, yeah, mansplaining's not cool.
I was out at dinner with some friends and casually brought up some work projects I'd been doing under a particular method, and I was sort of naming the issues I was having with that method, and a friend of a friend jumped in to say that if I felt that those issues were real, that I must not understand how to do the process. Even after clarifying that he had never actually worked using this method before. And I repeated that I had been working using that method and just found that there were some inherent problems with it. He continued to claim that there weren't inherent problems in my experience, but that I must not be interpreting things correctly. I'm used to standing up for myself. I am not always especially quick to back down when someone challenges me in that way. But despite sort of continuing to apply pressure and say, no, I think I understand, what I've been working on, he actually didn't drop it until my husband said, well, she's the one who's been working like this.
So, to start off, I get mansplained to so often that it's hard to remember most of the circumstances under which it happens. And, most of the time it's people that I consider friends or my boyfriend or my father or, lots of people that I'm really close to and that I love, and it's really irritating. But I guess some instances that have really stood out to me, both myself being mansplained to or other people. So I was listening to this presentation. It was a senior honors presentation by a girl who had been working on a project on Plato's Republic. She'd been working on it for a full year, and her thesis was really interesting, and her research was really compelling, and she obviously knew what she was talking about. And she got through her presentation in front of, 30 peers and a bunch of faculty, and we get to the questioning portion, and this kid immediately raises his hands, and the first words out of his mouth are, are you sure you know what you're talking about? Because Plato's Republic is even hard, for me. And it was just such a shutdown, and I felt really bad for her, but also, he looked like a huge dick. That was one of the more memorable moments of mansplaining that I've ever seen. Someone else in the room, under their breath, right after he said that, just said, "What a douche," really loudly. So this one day we're sitting in class, and it's a class on gender and enlightenment, and we were talking about pregnancy poetry. And this kid, who's one of the only men in the room, immediately says, all women experience pregnancy the same way, right? They just get to that point where they just want the baby out of their body. Which was great, because, of course, as the only man in the room, he gets to talk about the female experience. He also liked to talk a lot about how women's most important roles at the time were as mothers and daughters, and that's how they defined themselves, because he gets to decide how women define themselves. It was really irritating.
So I've been working in the same office for a year and a half, and this was actually just a couple weeks ago even. This wasn't even when I began working there. A man who works in my office came over to me when I was at the copy machine, and he goes, do you know how to use the copy machine? Do you know how to make copies? And I'm like, yeah, I do know how to make copies. I'm pretty familiar with this machine. I've been working here for a while, And he goes, oh, well, it's just pretty complicated, and there's a lot of things about it that are kind of nuanced that you might not know how to do, and I'm like, no, believe me, I've made plenty of copies here. I have scanned things, made copies, printed, and he's like, okay, well, I don't know, I feel like you just don't know how to do it. And at this point, I'm done copying, and I'm like, well, I made these copies. They're right here. But I guess I'll let you know if I ever need help figuring out how to copy on this very easy to operate copy machine. Yeah, so that's the story of a much older man at my work mansplaining to me. A year and a half after I started working there. A year and a half after I started making copies.
I was fortunate enough to have the topic of birth control mansplained to me. I was taking a class on human sexuality and another on the psychology of human relations. And in the human sexuality class, we just got done with a really in-depth unit about contraceptives, and I'd taken really good notes about it because it's such an important topic. And I'd taken the most careful notes of my life on the part about IUDs because it sounded like the best method of birth control for me. And I do actually have one now. And then as soon as we were done with that unit in human sexuality, we started a contraceptive unit in human relations. And the teacher thought that the best way for us to learn about it would be to assign us groups, and each group would teach the rest of the class about a different method. And my group was assigned IUDs. And I was like, wow, this is perfect. Here you go, group. And I took out my notebook and I'm like, here, it's all the information that the teacher wants us to give. And everyone was like, cool, awesome, we're done already. Except for one guy who's like, oh yeah, my girlfriend has one of these, so I know all about these already. Like, okay, cool. Maybe you can add any information that I don't have. Which I did have all of it. And he did add to it anyway. For instance, when I said that birth control, the IUD can last anywhere from 3 to 12 years, he said they last for 6 years. I'm like, oh, well, that's in that range. And he was like, we should say they last for 6 years. Like, well, there's a lot of different types, and Morena does last for 6 years, but I think we should definitely mention that there's a wide range there. And he was like, no, we should say they last for 6. And he was also dead set on telling the class that an IUD costs $400, which I just got one a couple weeks ago, and it cost me $1,400. But the whole class thinks it'll cost him $400 because he once again refused to accept my information over his. And we ended up giving a presentation with not wholly factual information to the class because he couldn't accept that I had better information than him, even though mine was written down directly from someone who has a PhD in human sexuality. He thought that his information that he just remembered from when his girlfriend got one was more valid than mine. So a big thank you to Jared for teaching me and everyone else in that class so much about IUDs.
One time I was at a party and I was pouring beer from a keg, and this guy came up to me and he was like, hey, let me help you. You have to hold it to the side and pour it so it doesn't foam. And I was like, thanks. I literally pour beer for a job. I know how to do it. And he insisted on helping me anyway. And I was like, dude, I literally know how to do this. Thanks, but no thanks. Have a good night.
So my boyfriend and I were talking about Kanye West's recent hospitalization after going on some political rants at concerts, and I was the one who brought it up, just as a conversation topic, and when I was talking about it, I thought that I had made it clear that I knew the situation and I knew what had happened as far as it was reported in the news, but my boyfriend was still like insistent upon like telling me exactly what he had read, like many of which were like the same articles that I had read, and like re-explaining to me the situation after I had told him that I knew the details. And also, it was especially frustrating because with pop culture, I'm much more likely to have the details, just in terms of our bases of knowledge. I'm definitely more of the like pop culture and like celebrity information knower. And later I talked to him about it, and he like reflecting on it, like agreed with me that he had been like mansplaining it to me. But like just the fact that he did it without thinking about it, as demeaning or condescending, was very, I guess, typical of what mansplaining even is.
Another issue I have sometimes with mansplaining is not even actually the act, but maybe something that goes along with this kind of ideology that, you know, oh, I'm a man and I must know more because I need to have my voice heard and whatever. And I obviously think about this a lot. But in one of my classes, which I think, at least for me, a lot of my classes in the art department are very overwhelmingly female, which is fine. So one of my classes, it's a sculpture class. There is this guy who openly talks about how he, like, you know, just is taking this for for a credit and is not necessarily too interested in art necessarily, but takes up so much space, I guess, to talk about how he, I guess, like, doesn't have that much of a background in art, but here's my opinion, or like, I don't have a background in this, but like, let me tell you about how, like, you can improve your piece, or like me and a lot of the other women in the room are art majors, so if you've ever met an art major, we think about our work all of the fucking time. So it's like, this guy that's coming in and just taking up so much talking room, I guess, if you want to talk about it that way, about how he doesn't know, but let me put in my input and tell you how you can improve your piece. And this just like overlaps into everything we do in this class, where I like, anytime anyone talks about mansplaining, this is like the perfect example every time I talk about it. Our TA had put out this like huge like pad of grid paper for us to use to do some scaled drawings, and I was going up, and I was one of the first people to go and tear off one of these perforated pieces of paper, like really simple, like definitely have torn off paper before. And he kind of like steps in because he's right next to me, like almost as to like stop me. He doesn't like physically touch me or anything, but it's like, oh, like like, actually, like, if you just go up to it and like tear it off, like on the side, like it comes off just like a sticky note, like just be really careful because like it might rip, but like it should be really easy to tear off. And I'm just kind of like sitting there, and I'm like, wait, did this guy just tell me how to tear off a piece of paper from a notebook? And I kind of just looked at him, and I kind of just looked at the paper, and like I feel like I stared into space like I was Jim in The Office, like, are you kidding me? Like, we're like breaking the fourth wall. But I just tore off a piece of paper and I walked away because it was just like not worth my time. But like, still to this day, kind of just makes me laugh how ridiculous this is sometimes.
When I was a grad student in sociology, we did social psychology and microsociology brown bags. So this is like, you have graduate students and faculty doing, every week you have somebody giving a presentation and people asking questions and giving feedback. Sometimes you're like at the very beginning of a project and trying to kind of get a sense of where to go. Other times people are presenting like some data analysis. But so we had, at the time, Jane Pilyavin, who's retired now, although she might still come back and teach sociology of sport, but she does a lot of stuff on self and identity. And I took a seminar with her on like specifically that topic and sort of how people construct the self. And she had, I think, a joint appointment here in Gender and Women's Studies. She always used to knit, like, so she would be around a table and she would always be knitting, like, every time. And so somebody gave a talk, and I asked some question, or I made some comment, like, and it's sort of like, oh yeah, okay, and people kept talking, and then a younger male faculty member who was like kind of a wonderkind and like mid tenure right around then, very early, said basically the same thing that I had just said, and everyone was like, wow, that's so insightful, and Jane Pilyavin looks up from her knitting and goes, Cabell just said that 2 minutes ago, and everybody's like, oh, and that was this really great moment, because I was like, yeah, I did just say that.
Hey Ben, it's Morgan. I wanted to send over my mansplaining story to you, so feel free to do whatever you want with it, chop it up, whatever makes sense. The first thing that came to mind when you had emailed me about mansplaining was when I was working at my previous agency a few years ago. And I guess it would be helpful to know this is an agency that specializes in events and conferences, kind of corporate gatherings, and also employee engagement. So it's not your typical ad agency, but it kind of has that same like old boys club feel going on. And so the first project that I got to work on was for a cancer research fundraiser, which took the form of a cycling event. So this was a 2-day cycling event where people could select one of 4 routes, so mileage points. I think you could ride 15 miles, 30 miles, 75 miles, or 100 miles, which is called a century, which I'm well aware of. But as as the guys in the room kept talking, it was evident that they felt the need to explain it to me. I don't know if that's because I was female or what, but and the thing is, you always know you're going to get mansplained when they call you sweetheart, because it always starts with, and sweetheart, a century is when cyclists will ride 100 miles consecutively. And so I tried to kind of let on that I knew what it was, and not only, have I heard of the term before, but I also did a long distance biking trip, so I had actually ridden several centuries myself and was well informed about this cycling trip, not only because it was in my own personal experience, but because I had read all of the briefs. So I was just just as informed as everyone else in the room, but it took forever for them to kind of explain it. And the language after you feel like you're getting mansplained is always so much more elementary than they previously were speaking to you. So they use smaller words and they speak slower once they feel like they need to explain something. So once I was at this conference and I was giving a talk about research that I had just spent several months of my life doing, and that I was really invested in, and that I had knew a lot about and had, done a lot of research on. And this kid comes up to me afterwards, and he immediately starts talking about all of the people that he could, put me in touch with that would really help with my research. And he's younger than me, and he goes to a school that's not quite as highly acclaimed as mine, and he keeps suggesting that his friends would be helpful. And I really didn't think they would be, because I had just done a bunch of research, and I knew what I was talking about already. And then he gave me his card and told me that I could ask him any questions I needed. Thanks, kid. You're great.
Actually, I have 3. So, back in time to when, right before I found out I was pregnant with my first kid, I had horrible abdominal cramping on a Friday evening, and so I was like, well, we have to go to urgent care, because if this gets worse, urgent care is going to close, we're going to have to go to the emergency department. You can, with abdominal pain, you can sit in the emergency department for 8 hours. So we go to urgent care, and there's this young doctor dude, and he goes through the questions, basic physical examination. He's like, well, we're gonna do some blood tests because this sounds like appendicitis. So they run these white cell blood whatever. They do some blood tests. They all come back totally normal range, no sign of appendicitis. The guy's like, well, I know these are normal. I just don't like this because the pain is concentrated in the lower right quadrant. And I'm like, no, it isn't. It's pretty central. It's not in the right quadrant. And the guy's going, we should do a CT scan because it sounds like it's appendicitis. And I go, okay, I might be pregnant and I don't want a CT scan. And the guy goes, well, pregnancy would not cause abdominal pain. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't say that. I said that I might be pregnant and I don't want to be irradiated. So I'm going home. And the guy's like, I really think you should get the CT scan. I'm like, if I get worse, I'll come back. Goodbye. And then literally 2 days later, I had a pregnancy test. Positive pregnancy test. And I'm going, hey, I'm glad I didn't let them irradiate me. When I talk to friends, when I talk to students, when I'm covering particularly disparities in healthcare and how women access care, a lot of us talk about needing to have this particular skill set, especially if you have disability or chronic illness, something where you're needing sort of continuous care, having a lot of contact with different providers, where you basically need to drop enough clues to lead providers to a particular conclusion, but with them assuming that it's their own idea. You have to make them think that it's their own idea to reach a particular diagnosis or treatment course. And actually, Hannah Blank, who wrote The Invention of Heterosexuality piece, has an essay she published a blog post that she published just recently, where she actually references some research that high information patients often have this experience of doctors basically just making sudden changes to their care to assert control. That when patients know too much or assert too much authority over their own experience and what their treatment should be, a lot of doctors react to that by jerking them around. And it has documented negative consequences for patient care. I mean, outcomes obviously are going to be worse when this happens. And she didn't mention gender specifically, but I have a really strong feeling that this is probably particularly pronounced for women, but also that women, we often have developed more skills for leading doctors to conclusions without letting them realize that it wasn't their idea.
So I often experience mansplaining with guys that I hang out with. Our friend group is primarily male, I would say. Really love my female friends too, but for whatever reason, it's mostly male. And one of my friends who is really just a great person, but sometimes just really, really fucks up, is just like loves to play devil's advocate, loves to kind of just push your buttons. And I think sometimes I just kind of will not talk to him because he kind of pisses me off in that way, because I just don't think it's necessary. But I remember several times with him, like where I'm studying design and I'm taking this second semester of drawing, and our TA, who's really, really wonderful, for our first assignment, was really dead set on us doing something super photorealistic, which is not my cup of tea, nor is it easy for me, which is fine, but isn't necessarily something for me that's going to like carry over into what I'm interested in design. So, of course, like just me who complains about everything, is just talking to one of my friends at a party with our group of friends, saying like, oh, like this is so frustrating, blah, 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 like, haha, whatever. I have to draw this photorealistic portrait of my boyfriend. And this guy who I was talking about is kind of overhearing this and goes, I really think that you should rethink how you're taking this drawing class. And I'm just kind of like, okay, and like my ear kind of turns that way. And he goes, yeah, like I really think it's important for you as like a graphic designer to like really like know how to draw. And I'm just like in my head like, okay, no shit, like whatever. I know that, like whatever. And I'm just like, yeah, like totally, that's true. I just don't know how like beneficial it is for me to like have to do this crazy photorealistic portrait. And he just like kept wanting to tell me how like it was so ridiculous that I kept blowing off the importance of my drawing class to my development as a design major, and I have to graduate so quickly, like I just want to get into my studies and just really be in it. So it's not that his points weren't valid, it was just like this ongoing conversation of, hi, here I come as like a math science major to tell you like what's beneficial for you as like an artist and a designer. And it was just really, really frustrating. And like it's really hard when you talk about mansplaining with your friends, because you're like, like generally for the most part you're a kind person and that's why we're friends, but we all mess up. So I don't know, I think it's just a lot of like male fragility in talking about this issue, because they just want you to know that they're trying to help out, but they don't understand more than half of the time that this is a really gendered issue, and that's what gets tough when you have to confront people like your friends or even, your boyfriend on things like that.
So there's this one dude who's friends with my significant other, and he's really argumentative and kind of has this mentality. He does have this mentality that you choose to feel pain. Like he believes that women and people of color and queer people choose to be hurt about the shit that happens to them as the result of the place that we live in. And whenever I go over to his house, he gets in these lengthy tangent arguments with me, and they usually revolve around gender. And this one time was explaining to me that gender isn't real and that he sees people as human and thus, like, he's a perfect being, like he's doing everything he can. And I explained to him zealously that gender is real, that it's something that we construct, of course, but that it has very real ramifications, and that those ramifications deeply influence people for the better or for worse, and you can't just shake it off. And you also need to understand that just by saying that you see people as human doesn't mean you're solving anything. Like, you need to acknowledge that gender is real and that women deserve equality, and you to acknowledge, like, all these specific issues in order to be helpful. But he's like, I'm doing my part by just saying that they're all the same. And he's a biochem person, so he's coming from this biological perspective where he's like, biological sex exists but nothing else does. Even that is not necessarily the case, at least like cohesively. Like, no one's perfectly one sex or another due to how sex works genetically. But he just went on this tangent with me for like an hour about how gender works, and then also how, like, alcohol perpetuates rape culture, and if we want people to not get raped, we should be telling people to not drink. And I was like, you're victim blaming, and that's also like a literal example of rape culture right now, right here. And he was just firmly convinced that if we really want to treat the problem, we just need to tell people to not drink rather than teaching men to not rape women. And I understand that that isn't always the gender layout of how rape happens, but it's the overwhelming majority. And the last time I talked to him was last night, and he literally moved me to tears because he was telling me that I choose to feel pain. And I was talking to him about how his girlfriend has come to me multiple times to tell me that she's upset by something that he said to her, and he said to me in response that he would do it again, and that it makes her question her ideas, and it makes her a stronger person because she's questioning her ideas. I don't think she's questioning her ideas when he tells her that she's choosing to be a crybaby about misogyny. What? And that's my problem with him, is because he just rants and rants and rants to me about how I choose to get worked up about things. I don't think I choose to feel pain. I don't think that most people do. And then on top of that, he's like, pain is good, pain is important, and it's important that I cause pain to her. And that's some fucked up shit. Yeah, so I just hate this person because he'll ask me about gender, which is something I should talk to him about and explain to him as a woman, but then he always interrupts me. He always just, like, uses that as an outlet for him to hear his own voice, and I'm freaking sick of it. He also says shit to me like, I don't see color, and that's the right way to operate. Like, you're not helping anyone, and you're not listening to me when I explain to you why that's not okay. And then you make me cry about it. So yeah, I hate this person a lot, but I guess have enough respect for other people's integrity to not mention his name, but I'll think about it. I'll come back to it, because I think accountability is really, really important. But that's the thing, too, is if y'all were to talk to this person and explain to him that he takes up too much space and that he needs to see gender and he needs to see color in order to help out, he needs to understand that the conversations that he has with everyone all the time create and influence our society, and that's why we need to be on our game 24/7. He wouldn't listen because he thinks that he doesn't make a difference. He also doesn't care to make a difference. He's told me that it doesn't matter for him to get involved in these topics. Like, what? You are involved. You are implicated. And And also, he would just throw this shit back at you, which he always says to me, and he always says to other people that he argues with, which is like, this conversation doesn't matter to me. I'm going to walk away and not feel anything from it. And it's like, cool. Congratulations. I'm so happy for you that you're this transcendent being without feelings. You know what that really is? That's privilege. That's not you, like, meditating a ton and convincing yourself out of harm that you're otherwise feeling. Like, you don't feel harm. I don't think he does. And that's just what really frustrates me about it is, like, whenever we talk or whenever I listen to him ramble, he always walks away scratch-free, and I always walk away broken, and it doesn't matter to him because he thinks that it strengthens my character, because he thinks he's doing a service to me. So yeah, it's a lot of bullshit. I'm sick of him. I'm sick of these intellectual dudes who think that they're using logic and intellect and argument to make people stronger. Like, no, those are words that you're using to oppress women. I don't think that's fine. I'm sick of people just playing devil's advocate all the time and not taking a side. That's not what bravery is. Bravery is learning all the facts and then taking a stance and sticking to it and sticking up for it. I don't respect you more because you're able to argue with me about what causes sexual assault. Alcohol doesn't cause sexual assault. Rapists cause sexual assault. What? What? Okay, that's all I have to say about that. I'm really fucking livid. I'm really fucking done. And yeah, and I'm mad that people in that friend group don't call each other out about it. I think it's the responsibility of men to accost other men to talk about misogyny. Just as I think it's the responsibility of white people to talk to other white people about racism. You know, we have power, we have privilege, and we're obligated to use it. We are obligated to use it, and he believes that none of this has to do with him, and that he doesn't have an effect. In reality, he does have an effect, especially when he causes someone to run out of his house crying because of things that he said to them. That's all I have to say. I'm fucking mad.
A recent example that I experienced with, I guess now one of my friend's ex-boyfriends. It was right after the election, and I was really, really upset, and we had just gone to the protest on the Capitol. It was like an anti-Trump protest. And we all went to one of my friend's house afterwards just to like talk about it and kind of process together and kind of just relax because it had been an exhausting couple of days, I think, for all of us. And my friend's ex-boyfriend, he was there, and he's just kind of one of those people that, you know, he's a good guy, like whatever, but I don't necessarily feel passionately about talking to him every time I see him, to put it lightly, I guess. So comes up to me, definitely is someone that like loves to talk about themselves, which is fine, whatever, but I just kind of don't care, I guess. But comes down and sits next to me, and I'm assuming that he's going to start talking about how, you know, he this, he that, he blah, 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 blah. So I'm just kind of like, oh, great, here he comes. But he sits down, and the first thing he says is, oh, like, how are you doing? How are you processing this? Like, you must be taking this really hard, which I was, and it was, like, all over my face. And I'm like, yeah, you know, like, this is really tough. This has been really tough for me as a woman, as a queer person, as a Latino person. Like, this has been, God, an exhausting couple of days. Lots of crying and lots of just, you know, sleeping and trying to ignore the world and trying to be proactive and all of that all mixed together. You know, and I started talking about how in one of my classes, one of my TAs is just this really, really wonderful woman, and how she took time aside because it was the day after, or 2 days after the election, just to put away time for us to just process and talk. And I guess, humanities and the art department in general is just kind of a safe space for people that, would be upset about Donald Trump being our president-elect. So we talked about this really openly, and one of the topics that we touched on was internalized misogyny, which I talked about a lot with my aunt, and just how, we think that contributed a lot to how people perceived Hillary compared to this extremely underqualified man, just objectively underqualified. And how, from the beginning of our lives as women, we're kind of taught by society to be in competition with other women, and how that, for some of us, for me, like, I came to a realization that I did that, growing up, and I try now to just be so conscious, because women are amazing and we need to support each other. But anyway, we're talking about that. I talked to that with him, and I was like, yeah, like, it's just something I've really been thinking about, because God, like, it hurts just as a woman to just have this taken away from you. And I was just so looking forward to seeing my first female president, which I don't even know if that's gonna happen in my lifetime now, like, because I just thought it was such a sure thing. And I keep talking about misogyny, internalized misogyny, whatever. And when I'm done, I'm assuming he's going to, like, keep talking about it, just, kind of is one of those people that'll just kind of reiterate your points to just kind of agree with you, whatever. But the thing that he says, he goes, I've been thinking about that too. And when I think about that, I just think that it's important for us to set aside things like, I don't know, misogyny, and really focus on the real issues at hand in our society. And I just kind of, like, looked at him, and then I looked away, and I was just kind of didn't know what to say. And at that point, my boyfriend had walked into the room, and so I was just like, oh, look, there's my boyfriend. I'm gonna leave now. Like, bye. I, like, just didn't even say anything, because I just couldn't believe that he was trying to tell me, as someone who experiences misogyny and gender bias on a daily basis, that it wasn't an issue, and it isn't something that we should be focusing on right now, because it's, to me, and to a lot of women, and to a lot of men, and to a lot of, everyone, it's something that we all need to think about right now. And I was just so in shock that he would say something like that to me, especially just as, like, I don't know, like indie white boy, whatever. It just, like, made me so upset, so I couldn't even say anything. And it's something, like, now every time I see him, because he's kind of an extended part of our friend group, it just, yeah, I'll be civil, but I just, like, don't even want to try to be friends with you. It's just, like, it was so disrespectful to me, and I don't think I'll ever stop thinking about that every time I see his face. This was about a couple months ago or so. We had, like, cultural competency training at my work, which was really great, really constructive, especially because I think we have issues with diversity where I work, which is, I guess, just the university system at large anyway. But we did this little exercise that was basically, like, filling out this little circle on a piece of paper as, like, a pie chart of, like, pieces of your identity. And so things that were more important to how you identify were, like, larger pieces of this pie chart, and things that, they had, like, a list, like, ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, etc., like, class, like, social standing, whatever. And we had to answer all those questions and put that on the chart, and, like, how big those pieces contributed to how you conduct yourself every day. So we kind of broke up into different groups, because there's a ton of people that were there for my work. And it was me and this other girl who I know we get along really well. We think very similarly. And then this guy who I haven't had a ton of experience with at that point. I'd been mostly just working over the summer and a couple of months before the spring semester had ended. So I hadn't really gotten to talk to him that much, but just, whatever. We were just coworkers, I guess. And for me, a big part of my identity when I was talking about that and making that little chart to kind of discuss was being a Latina woman, how that's so ingrained in my culture and how I grew up and how my family operates, how, like, my dad is like a white dude, like he'll stick out like a sore thumb just because like the tradition from my mother's family is so strong. It's something that, we still continue even though I'm just a little bit over half. So I was talking about that and how, the biggest part of one of the bigger parts, I guess, of my pie is being a Latina woman. And me being just ambiguous in the way that I look, I guess, to people that are subscribed to stereotypes, expected that someone be like, wow, you're Latino, like what, like, oh my god, like, because that always happens. And it's fine, I get that my looks are pretty ambiguous. So this guy that was in my group goes, wow, I had no idea that you were Hispanic. And I go, oh yeah, like, it's, haha, like, I am, like, I don't know, whatever. And he goes, oh, well, you just like look so white. And just me trying to be conscious of myself and other Latino people. It's like, and I was like, oh, well, not all Latino people look the same, because it's true. There's white, black, Asian, everyone. Latino's not a race. It's been racialized, of course, but that's a conversation for another time. And so, I give my typical, not all Latino people look the same. And he goes, well, but you just look so white. And I'm like, what is this guy trying to say right now? Like, he needs to calm down. And I was like, yeah, but, like, I like didn't know what to say, because usually people just go, oh, yeah, you're totally right, I'm sorry. And and so he's just like, you look so white, like, I just would have never known. And I'm like, yeah, like, that's, why I just told you, and why, it's important for me to vocalize that that's part of my culture, because it gets erased because of, the way that this society subscribes to stereotypes, and that I'm supposed to be like a dark brown, black hair, brown-eyed person to be Latino, which is obviously not true. So he just kind of went a little too far in trying to, like, get me to say, oh no, just kidding, like, or whatever. I don't even really know what he was trying to do, but just assert that, he had been wrong, and so I must be wrong, because there has to be another piece of the puzzle to a reason of why he was not understanding my ethnicity clearly, at least in his point of view.
So I get migraines, so I'd been going round and round with neurology for a couple of years, like various treatments, none of which work. And finally, because I failed 4 different classes of drugs, insurance was willing to cover Botox for migraine, which is amazing. So I had to go in for these Botox injections, and there's a fellow, like, the fellows, like, they're through med school, they've done a residency, now they're, like, doing extra training for, like, specialty medicine. So we have a headache clinic at UW Hospital, and neurology has a headache clinic, so this guy's, like, a pain fellow, like, this is a specific, getting, I think, more prestige, more people going into, like, pain management specifically. So I have my neurologist, who I've seen a few times, she's all right, who's doing the Botox, but this guy comes in and he's, like, doing the sort of, like, he's basically, like, doing the sort of, like, intake stuff for this appointment. And he comes in and he's like, he's like, blah, blah, Miss Gathman, which immediately gets, actually, it's Dr. Gathman, like, and then he's like, got me sitting down, and he's basically just, like, telling me, like, oh, this is gonna be, like, here's what we do with the procedure, we do these injections at these different sites, and we're going, these are the very rare side effects, blah, 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 like facial paralysis, you know. And he goes through all this, and I'm like, okay, so if I do get like this very rare thing where there's like some facial paralysis stuff, I'm like, does that increase the odds that it's going to happen again? Or is that just like an administration issue where, you know, because it is like, you know, they're injecting toxins into your muscles. Like, it's very precise. And he's like, oh, well, you know, it's very rare that that happens. Like, it's almost never going to happen. Like, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, but if it does happen, is it a statistically independent event? Like, and he just, like a third time, he's like, it's out of, you know, so many thousand cases. Well, and I'm just like, okay, you know what, never mind. I guess I'll ask again if it happens. Like, since you can't answer this, like, very basic risk-related question. And yeah, so that was kind of typical with fellows. We went in, this was after my second kid was born. We had a consult with perinatology to talk to them. They basically like risk management and stuff because I'm on blood thinners and I've had 2 postpartum hemorrhages, so like I'm on issues. And so we went in because the second hemorrhage was worse than the first, so we went in to like talk to them about whether that's something that you expect to see a progression or if that was just kind of luck of the draw. So we go in, and again, there's a fellow. So there's a med student tracking the like perinatologist, like a younger woman, and then this guy who's a perinatology fellow. So he's leading again on like the patient history, and he's like asking me these questions, like blah blah blah, you know, and like basically, except he's not asking questions. He's like looking at my chart and like telling me like all of my medical history, and I'm like, you know. Finally, the perinatologist, who's this older woman, breaks in and is like, but you know, you're the one who actually has this health history, so you're the one who's going to know the most about what's happened with your own body, and we have a lot to learn from you. And I'm like, yes, you do, some of you, you know. And so the guy like does ask a few questions, and we're talking like, so we start talking about the specific births, and I said something, I was like, yeah, and I have PTSD, and the guy's like, oh, from the hemorrhages. And I'm like, no, actually, from abusive behavior from the supervising physician in labor. And like the perinatologist, I'm looking directly at this guy. I'm like, I don't expect you to comment on that. I would rather that you didn't, because you weren't there, and most of the time doctors don't want to discuss other doctors' like negligence and abusive behavior. I'm like, but that is why. And the perinatologist looks at him and looks at the med student and goes, I hope you're both listening very carefully. And it was so beautiful. Like,